Biology and social conditioning teach us to recognize physical dominance as the primary indicator of power. In this primitive framework, the capacity to destroy a rival is the highest proof of strength. G.W.F. Hegel argued that this drive for conflict is central to the development of self-consciousness. Humans engage in a life-and-death struggle to force others to recognize their independence, essentially risking their lives to prove they are more than just a biological process. This behavior is reinforced by the brain's dopamine reward circuit. When violence is used as a tool to mug someone or launch a war, it is often a cold, calculated strategy. Dopamine drives the pursuit of a specific resource, rewarding the brain for effective domination. But when the brain perceives a threat to its internal status rather than an external resource, the neurochemistry shifts. Seeking gives way to panic. If the self-image is hollow or fragile, the brain treats a verbal slight or a boundary as a physical breach, triggering a reactive explosion intended to repair the perceived damage. A person who remains trapped in this cycle of reactive defense isn't a master of their environment. They are a slave to their own neurochemistry, requiring constant external submission to mask an internal instability. This instability is why arguing with toxic people feels like a circular battle. They aren't interested in a solution or the truth. They are fighting to protect a self-image that cannot survive honesty or vulnerability. Aggression and self-awareness share an inverse relationship. When a person lacks the capacity to sit with their own discomfort, their only remaining tool for navigating the world is reactivity. As their internal awareness drops, their external aggression must increase to compensate. In this state, a person moves through life in reaction mode. Without reflection, they process every minor disagreement as an attack. A different opinion feels like disrespect. A personal boundary feels like a total rejection. This perspective is a byproduct of what Thomas Metzinger calls the ego tunnel. While this survival mechanism simplifies reality to help us make quick decisions, it also traps us in the illusion that we are a unified, separate being navigating an objective world. Clinging to this separate, isolated identity creates a permanent state of war. A person must invent enemies just to justify the existence of their own defensive perimeter. The limits of worldly conquest are best illustrated by a historical meeting between an emperor who owned the world and a man who wanted nothing from it. Alexander the Great once visited Diogenes the Cynic. While Alexander stood surrounded by his guards and his accomplishments, Diogenes was resting in the dirt. When asked if there was any favor he could grant, the philosopher simply asked the emperor to move out of his sunlight. Alexander had spent his life conquering the world through violence. Diogenes responded with complete confidence that he had conquered the need to conquer the world. The conqueror's power was conditional. Alexander required the submission of the world to feel significant. Diogenes, by contrast, had removed the internal desires that would have made him vulnerable to the emperor's influence. Invulnerability comes from eliminating the internal desires that provide an opponent with leverage. If you want nothing, you cannot be coerced. Reaching this state of peace requires a psychological restructuring known as ego death, the dissolution of the boundaries that separate the self from the world. This aligns with the Buddhist doctrine of anatta, or no self. It challenges the idea of a permanent, unchanging core identity, suggesting that the story your mind tells about you is an illusion. Carl Jung described a similar process in his theory of individuation. He argued that the ego must confront the unconscious and dissolve its illusions of separation to reveal something larger than the individual. This process is often agonizing because the self perceives its own undoing as annihilation. Stripping away your name, shedding your career and your memories feels like a slow-motion execution of everything you believe yourself to be. The ego resists this loss because it cannot imagine existing as raw, unattached awareness. When those boundaries are finally dismantled, the concept of an enemy becomes irrelevant. Without a fragile ego left to be threatened or offended, there is nothing for a hostile force to target. A person who has experienced this shift doesn't lose the ability to act. They lose the impulse to react. They navigate the world with a sovereign mind. Stoicism offers a practical framework for this state. It requires a person to test every impulse against a filter of reason and justice. Rather than being bounced around by external events, a person brings their impulses to heel like a trained dog. As Epictetus wrote, "A wise person does not engage in quarrels." Socrates demonstrated this by remaining cool even when his conversation mates became exasperated or aggravated. He was more interested in hearing what others had to say than in winning an argument. This mastery involves the power to hold no opinion about a negative event. By practicing the ability to have no thoughts about a slight, a person makes the provocation irrelevant. If the event doesn't register in your mind as an injury, it has no power over you. Refusing to be drawn into a fight is a demonstration of self-mastery. It indicates that your choices are governed by your own principles rather than the maneuvers of your enemies. The strategic endpoint of this philosophy is formlessness. By refusing to commit to a fixed form or a defensive posture, you become ungraspable. The Tao Te Ching describes this as overcoming without conquering. It is the act of choosing what must be done and then stopping, without seeking rewards or making claims. You use strength without forcing things. In a conflict, being as vaporous as possible plays upon a common human weakness, the inability to endure a void. When you give an opponent nothing to hit, they often chase after you madly, losing their capacity for strategic thought and exhausting their own energy in the process. This state of being ends the cycle of the life and death struggle. You realize that your existence does not need to be validated by the defeat of another. You take responsibility for your choices, fully aware of your own finite nature.